Hello and welcome to another one of these commentary videos. I have a new one which is about consciousness. I think my two favorite subjects are probably consciousness and morality, but also free will as a kind of um, extension of both of those other two subjects. So free will, I think, is something related to consciousness, and free will also plays a big part in concepts of morality and responsibility. But in this one, I'm going to talk about consciousness. I found this 20-minute video with Alex O'Connor again and Joe Foley. It's an excerpt from a longer conversation that they have, but I will probably turn this into a longer than 20-minute video. So I'm going to play this video and throw out some ideas that I have related to whatever they're talking about. All right. And then we'll go here.
I have a quite simple, straightforward one next.
Yeah.
What is consciousness?
Oh yeah. No. Oh yeah.
So
I reckon we
simple.
probably rattle off a few answers. Now,
Wrap this
Jason.
up in
This is like
30 seconds.
the mystery.
But in a way, maybe we can, because of course, it's a bit of a cop-out, but it is worth saying that you can be an atheist whilst not being a materialist.
Yes, I mean this is almost like the kind of runs like that would apply to the logic one. Indeed, loads of ones.
You can believe that consciousness is this strange, immaterial. You can believe in the existence of the soul. You can believe in all of that kind of stuff, and just not believe in like an agential God overseeing it all. It would be quite weird.
Yeah,
Maybe. It would still be like weirder that there wasn't some like creator non-material thing, but like it's possible to be of that persuasion.
Yeah.
So it's worth noting that. But I think really the question here, put in the context of atheists not being able to answer it, is like consciousness seems like a very strange thing to expect if there is no intention behind the universe and if there is no immaterial element to the universe, because consciousness seems like it's immaterial. It seems, I mean, we can answer this as if we were looking for questions that materialists can't answer.
Yeah,
you know, like,
exactly.
consciousness is very strange. I've talked about it a lot recently. People who've been listening to my recent material will know that I'm just bemused by consciousness.
Well, it's one of the weirdest things. You know, this as in it's a bit like the laws of logic in the sense that it's one of the weirdest things and one of the most obvious things. What are you going to do to like? It's like I think it's Paul Churchland is a limited materialist, so he thinks that consciousness doesn't exist. Like, and he thinks about it. His point is more nuanced than that. But like, I remember reading one of his papers and being like, "What do you mean? How do I even go about disbelieving in consciousness?
Is
This
an
seems
illusion."
like it's like how do you expect me to not believe in consciousness? It seems
The immediate problem that I see arising every time people talk about consciousness, and especially intellectual people talking about consciousness, or just about anybody, is just they don't define it. This is in relation to atheism versus religious justifications for the existence of consciousness, which is what they're really talking about. But the problem with talking about consciousness ever is talking about the definition of consciousness. What are you actually talking about? So if somebody says consciousness doesn't exist or consciousness is not material, then their definition of it relies on those characteristics or the lack of characteristics that I described. But then they're not talking about the same type of consciousness that other people are talking about. So some people think of consciousness as a like another word for the soul, or another word for just maybe emotions or having feelings about things. But that's not what I would define consciousness as. So the way that I think about consciousness is material, it is physical, it's real, and it is a umbrella term for a lot of different things that happen psychologically and are communicated via language primarily, or through symbols, at least in the case of art, which I think is an expression of a certain conscious activity or unconscious activity. unconsciousness and subconsciousness are also very broad terms and very hard to define. At least it seems. I think subconsciousness makes sense because it's everything that like we're not aware of, and unconscious means kind of similarly that we're unaware of it, but that there may not be something to be aware of, like when somebody is knocked out and not dreaming, I suppose. But so to me, consciousness is best summed up into the concept of personal subjectivity, or the subjective experience. The experience, which means that it has to do with events over time, and internal and subjective in that they are understood uh, um, and accessed via the individual who's having those experiences. And because those experiences are psychological and in the mind, brain, and body, and that's where they are sort of housed and contained, they aren't accessible to the outside observer, and that makes it difficult to study, measure, and define. And because it's hard to define and measure and all that stuff, it's hard to approach scientifically, and it's also hard to talk about. And so whenever people talk about consciousness, I think they should talk about what they fucking mean by consciousness. It's kind of similar to the concept of God. When you say God, that's not a narrow word. It can mean a ton of different things. So when people talk about God, they tend to presuppose a certain version of God, and in America, it tends to be Christian God, or at least that type of singular um, uh, entity that affects and judges humans. So anyway, I think of subjectivity or internal, not subjectivity on a scientific concept, but subjectivity as far as subjective experience or internal experiences and consciousness as an umbrella term that involves some different processes and is um, uh, in certain aspects can be it's like the engine that produces a few different things, and some of those things are um, internal dialogues, internal thinking. Thinking is internal, obviously, but that um, uh, internal symbolic representation of concepts that are linked, like a sentence has linking concepts that are logical enough to make sense, whether they're accurate to other people or not, or make sense to other people or not. And so I think that in talking about consciousness, you can't get rid of the fact that we think and that we observe our own thinking. And so it's not just thinking in the dark, it's thinking and responding to ourselves and observing what we're thinking simultaneously as if we were in dialogue with another person. And how that comes about is probably a adaptation um, of our ability to talk to other people. So I'm guessing we probably uh, talked, or language was developed, and in communicating with others, eventually we adapted the ability um, to create a module in our brain that represents the other. And in doing that, we also may have developed the ability to talk to ourselves as if we were talking to another person, or multiple people, which is why it seems like oftentimes you have different voices in your head and they might have different opinions. And I think it's when people uh, are mistaken about who that other person is that they um, become delusional and paranoid, schizophrenic type behavior, or multiple personalities, because it goes awry, and we no longer recognize the other voice as ourself, but it's always just you. So I think that's a huge component. So I think that neuroscience and um, um, studying the brain and these neural correlates of consciousness, the things that happen while we're conscious and that seem to relate to our ability to have these internal monologues, is something that people are studying, and that I think will help um, illuminate the science behind consciousness. Um, and I think it's the language is kind of um, a symbolic um, representation of what's happening underneath the linguistic level, which is um, uh, modeling, or creating um, uh, uh, individual and referential models in the head of both physical things in the environment, like chairs and roads and people, but also at different levels how they relate to each other. So the brain has models of discrete things, but those are all contextual in because our definitions of those things typically rely on context. So a chair can be thought of as kind of a generic form of a chair. Oh, let's do this. Hiya. I'm good at this. But a chair is also somewhat not understandable without the context of uh, rooms and sitting and materials of what a chair is. And the same is true of everything that we conceive inside our heads, and our ability to model the world and um, to allow for models that are essentially animated inside our heads. They're models of cause and effect of of how things work and interact with each other, that we can we can have an internal perception of all the stuff, all the things, and including ourself, and so we can have a self-conception as well, and you can think about yourself in the world and how you interact and how people see you, but you can also understand other things external to yourself. And because all of this exists within a model of how things interact, it isn't stationary and set. It also includes time, and so we have a a good perception of how long things take and how the day is, and we have we know that some things interact fast and slow, and we have reaction times and things like that, and we understand that well enough to be able to model um, the past and the future, or the past and the future, um, in a way that allows us to plan ahead. And our ability to learn from our experiences and from others who are somewhat implanting their models into our head, and we're adapting our own models all the time. And those models allow us um, to hopefully, if free will has something to say about it, um, uh, it allows us to plan for the future in a way that um, takes into account consequences and effects. And so, as we learn about what we think causes other things, we can adapt our behavior to have more favorable outcomes in the future. And that to me is another big aspect of consciousness, and it's typically communicated through language. So our language is like a way to discreetly communicate with ourselves and others those models and those expectations and reactions and things. So those are two really big aspects of consciousness, and to me, that's all internal to the body and is primarily processed and housed and recalled from the brain. And I think that the rest of the body, with its manufacturing of things like hormones and other proteins and neurotransmitters, and those get circulated throughout the body. All of that actually is important, and it's not just this brain in a vat type experience. Although I think that the brain is the place to look. So during this conversation, it doesn't seem like they're really talking about that, and they're making some assumptions about what consciousness is, and they're starting to talk about, if you believe in God, then you immediately insert a kind of consciousness inventor. And if you don't believe in God, then you are stuck with this conundrum of how to describe it in a measurable and scientific way. But atheism actually doesn't necessarily imply scientific logic, or it doesn't imply that they're capable of explaining anything properly. Atheism just really means that they don't believe that God has anything to do with it, and then that can lead to other belief systems, and or just a lack of understanding. If you just don't know, then maybe it's something else. So anyway, I'm only a minute in, and so anyway, we'll keep going.
It's like one of the only things that is really self-evidently there.
Yeah.
Again, on par with something like the laws of logic.
Sorry, just a second. I realize that I'm allowing the audio to just go through my TV instead of my headset, so it's probably echoing a little bit.
It's arguably it's the filter through which I view everything else in the world.
Yes.
If I'm not conscious, like where do I begin? And you know what? Again, you're right. I think that the difference here, though, I think with consciousness compared to something like morality, and why I think that the atheist has a more sensible anti-materialist position here. Like I don't think it kind of I don't think it gets us in as many epistemological binds, is that we have direct empirical evidence of consciousness. So if something is going to be the exception to the materialist rule, it's going to be consciousness, because if the materialist rule is broadly downstream of this kind of broad naturalist empiricist approach, then if there's going to be an exception, consciousness is going to be the least controversial one.
I don't think people might expect me to have some. The thing is, I'm not a neuroscientist.
No, me neither.
And I think that this is a relevant field, right? Like there may be these wonderful explanations for what consciousness is on a purely materialistic framework. I've tried to sort of discover them. I've tried to interview people who might be able to give me some ideas, and I've been left sort of wanting. And I'm just perfectly happy to say that I'm like agnostic on the question of materialism because of consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of approaching the same sort of place. I mean, Francisco Varela is a neuroscientist who's been looking at like correlations between like certain mental states and certain like physical brain states and stuff like that. But again, we're so far away from a kind of reductive materialist program of consciousness, and you know, I'm not suggesting that it definitely can't happen. I don't quite buy into the like Thomas Nagel, David Chalmers, nothing physical in principle could explain consciousness.
Yeah.
You know, it strikes me that it could, if we're just like blue sky thinking, then there could be a kind of future scientific paradigm that is as dissimilar from our current way of thinking about consciousness as like the mechanistic view of the world was from the teleological Aristotelian view of the world.
I was
like,
just thinking that,
you know, just like this kind of and that's but to a certain extent that's like idle, right? Because like scientific revolutions almost by definition are pretty unpredictable. As in, you can't predict what they're going to be in advance. You might be able to predict when they're going to be. But so that would be like my first point, is that I wouldn't. I think that it's probably. I'm not convinced that materialism is like completely blown to pieces there. But I also think that it will be unwise to say that it survived it, because it hasn't yet.
Yep.
There are some cracking responses to this sort of worldview, though. There's a guy called Galen Strawson.
Yep.
You know,
I get him mixed up with Peter Strawson, one
yes,
the son
of
the
yeah,
other. And
are they related?
I think
That's so cool.
And-
I mean,
and
presumably Galen's the son of.
Yeah, because then I must have met Galen.
I mean, yeah. I mean, Pete Strawson's awesome, and Galen Strawson, I think, is also very cool. Though I only really know him for this. This idea that he suggests, that he is an atheist and he is a naturalist, and he just thinks that consciousness is part of the natural building blocks of the world. You know, he just thinks that consciousness is. He thinks that consciousness is some sort of. So, I'm sorry. I'll start from the beginning of what I take to be part of his reasoning chain. So he starts. For the first thing I suppose to note is that a consciousness is at least potentially gradable, right? You can get more or less of it.
Seems
both
reasonable.
on the kind of drifting in and out of consciousness. I went from being unconscious to conscious this morning, and from the kind of, if you were to gradually remove bits of my brain in like a horrifyingly sadistic manner, then in theory it seems intuitive that I would become less and less of a conscious being, until I was dead and was no longer a conscious being.
Yeah, it seems strange if there was just like a point where everything just switches off all at once.
But you wouldn't be dead if you weren't conscious. Although your ability to identify yourself would be gone, it is interesting to think of consciousness as being the only real way that you know that you exist, and I think that's probably true in the human experience, that consciousness is very, very linked with identity, and because of this modeling system that allows you to model yourself. But I think the idea that consciousness is on a continuum makes a lot of sense, and I would put my hat in the ring of people who believe that, because I think that if consciousness is physical and comes from biology, and then there, and maybe not just from organic material, I think that because of the definition of consciousness as a type of process that, or it comes from a process, or it's emergent from the processes of smaller components like cells and electronic, or not electronic, but electrical signals, that animals of all sorts could be conscious, in that they have modeling systems and have language and potentially have internal models of themselves, at least in some capacity, in a way that allows them to learn and plan and potentially alter their future behavior based on past experiences. So I think that they probably have experiences, and they are in different stages of linguistic complexity internally. And not linguistic like words, but more symbols, or at least somewhat discrete identities of things. Like a lion knows the difference between itself and other lions, and a lion knows the difference between a deer and a tree. It doesn't attack the tree, it knows the difference, and so there's some type of discrete modeling that's occurring potentially, and maybe a bacteria doesn't have that level of consciousness, but it may have. I actually don't really think bacteria are conscious, and I don't think, but maybe a bug like a bee would be it's hard to imagine a bee as being conscious in the same way that I am. So it's hard to ascribe it to it. It does seem like at some point of uh, n- neurological um, scale that there just isn't a need for internal modeling of the nature that allows for um, adaptive change. Like it's really just instinct. It's just um, purely reactionary. So when a bee sees um, a flower that it is um, that is in its repertoire of pollinating things, then it goes to that and it sees a thing that isn't. I don't know that it actually learns that behavior as opposed to just um, instinctually or automatically goes toward the one that it's going to pollinate. Whereas, like a dog um, learns to not engage in certain behaviors based on um, its expectation of the future. And maybe that's just built into um, automatic neurological um, firings or neurological memory. And so it's definitely really tricky to parse between um, the purely uh, instinctual and the potentially um, uh, conscious, so or cognitive or that's why I think it's an important thing to discuss whether or not consciousness is an illusion, because if it's all just automatic reaction and instinct, then the thinking that goes on is um, uh, purely um, observant and not capable of interacting with the outside world. And it doesn't create feedback loops of action. It just is a kind um, stream um, of responses or a stream of instincts. But I don't I think that the if there's a mechanism for free will, it relies on this ability to um, for the um, for the mind to interact with the outside world, and for it to make real actionable changes, and for and if we're able to uh, alter what we may have done purely instinctually via planning and internal modeling, um, that would allow for free will, and that's why I think consciousness is something um, that is not shadows on a wall. Anyway, continue here.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's one kind of facet of his argument. The other is him basically saying, well, there is nothing as obvious as the existence of consciousness. Which, that's reasonably well, I think therefore I am is you might have issues with the argument, but as a whole, there's very little self-evident as consciousness. And then he basically says, well, then if the consciousness either by structure or by just matter, the preconditions for consciousness must already be out there, and we can kind of think about consciousness along this kind of gradation scale. And so he's sort of a panpsychist, but not in the sense that he thinks that rocks can think. Like he's kind of, it's very few panpsychists actually think that.
Panpsychists don't think that rocks can think.
No, exactly. Because there's
someone somewhere does think that.
Yeah, I'm sure someone somewhere will. But
I have a podcast with Philip Goff on panpsychism.
Yes,
if people are interested, panpsychism, the view that sort of everything is conscious, but kind of more like, his view is more like the fundamental building blocks of the universe is consciousness, and it is everywhere.
Yeah,
kind of
so
thing.
Strawson's position is reasonably similar to that. He's sort of saying, well, the potential for consciousness must already be there in matter. And that's sort of how he gets around.
It makes sense, man. Like it makes sense to suggest that like there is just something about. I mean, it seems like really weird. Well, why would the fundamental like material of the universe like be consciousness or have consciousness or provide for consciousness? Well, like why would the fundamental matter of the universe like have energy and vibration and velocity and mass? Like all of these properties are completely mysterious. There's no reason not to ascribe consciousness or consciousness permitting fundamental properties to the sort of subatomic particles.
And if you are a materialist, then you're unlikely to conceive of consciousness and in this kind of Cartesian dualist way, where it's like it's one thing, right? You have consciousness and it is a single object. You're more likely to view it along the lines of gradation, along the lines of, well, it's composed out of something else. And Strawson's point is, well, if it's composed out of something else, then the preconditions must be in the thing that was there. And then, and I think we are broadly more comfortable talking about gradations of consciousness. And this also...
From idea to submission, empower students to do their best work with Grammarly's comprehensive AI writing assistance.
This kind of comes up a little bit in integrated information theory, which is another theory of consciousness, where the integrated information is everywhere. It's not just in human subjects. I'm not suggesting that this is like necessarily a knockdown way of viewing consciousness, but I'd see real potential here for a philosophical framework for analyzing consciousness that is non-theistic and like not even that different from materialism. Like if you think that, because materialism, most of the attractive qualities of materialism just comes about from the fact that it's monist. It's just one type of stuff. And like the physicalist stroke materialist side of it is great in some ways, but there's if you could have one type of stuff that has preconditioned properties of consciousness and non-conscious properties, it doesn't strike me as like absurd that would also has loads of the philosophical strengths of materialism without this potential consciousness weakness. Of course, the reply to that is, isn't this all a bit ad hoc? Isn't this all like you've got a problem and you're just being like, well, there must have been consciousness before then? Yeah. How explanatory is that? And I don't think I have a very good response to that.
No, but then if God is being sort of filled in here purely because of considerations of consciousness,
well, yes, then
God's just sort of doing the same thing, right? And so to the question, what is consciousness? Is this a question that atheists can't answer?
Well, I think that it's a question that, on the face of it, materialists would struggle to answer, and to the extent to which a theist doesn't have materialist constraints, then the theist could answer it, and the atheist would struggle. But
it comes again to like, what do you mean by consciousness? Like, an atheist or a theist can talk about consciousness if they both agree that it exists in whatever way they want based on their definition of it. And Christians believe in free will, and so consciousness just sort of is like entangled with that belief. And it's because Christians have this, they take, they've answered that fundamental question. They can just take that for granted and move forward. And so consciousness is just another part of God's gifts to people, and allows for and it's easy. But like they were saying, for a materialist, it's just not that easy. But if science is essentially the process of understanding physical materials and how they interact and what they really are, or what they are composed of, then there will likely be holes and room for discovery and lots of ignorance, because science is a very critical and exploratory domain. And so that's why consciousness is very difficult, is because if you're a materialist or a physicalist, or you believe that things that all the stuff that is real is something that could theoretically be measured or discovered, even if we never do discover it. The That's just a limitation of people, or of our tools, or of our minds, but fundamentally those things are still there. And because I think all the evidence from science tends to illuminate and account for things as physical, and because we've discovered things that we didn't know without additional tools, like different spectrums of light that exist whether we can see them or not, but we see them with technologies. It seems like the more we learn and the more we understand, the more we can put things into a category of measurable physical things. And so I don't see why consciousness should be put into a different category. So it's just a matter of defining it properly and coming up with ways to measure it, and ways to create experimentation on it, which obviously we experiment with consciousness personally all the time, but trying to understand it from an external perspective is very difficult. Anyway.
But I think this kind of panpsychist idea has potential, as does integrated information theory. I think that and I do think that the Strawsonite, I suppose, panpsychist or Strawsonian panpsychist theory, at the very least, does strike me as not explanatorily totally inert, because it predicts certain things. Like, it would predict gradations of consciousness depending on the structure, and we can, I think, broadly have a pretty good argument for gradations of consciousness based on structure. Eric Schwitzgebel is really, really keen on this at the moment. He's a professor at UCLA, and he's really hammering this point home at the moment. So I think that I don't think that this sort of modest panpsychism is as explanatorily inert as people give it credit for, as people kind of criticize it for.
People who've been listening to me recently will know that, as I say, consciousness has baffled me, especially as of late. It started with this podcast, right? Like, I'm speaking to people like Anil Seth and Philip Goff and Josh Rasmussen, and I'm just my mind is blown, or my brain is blown, or both, maybe. I don't know. But like people will know, it's kind of become a bit of a meme in many ways. I'm just asking people, like, where is the triangle in my head? Like, where is it, man? Like, show me the triangle. I saw someone made a meme of this, me with like a gun, being like, I'm no longer asking, like, where is the triangle? Because it does, it freaks me out. I lose sleep over it. There's another question sort of on our list, which I sort of think functions here, or fits in here. Somebody said on consciousness, this is one of your subscribers: why could my body have not accomplished all the same evolutionarily favorable tasks, simulated all the emotions and motivations, firing neurons in complex, possibly deterministic sequences of pattern response, without me being there to experience it? I mean, a bit of a complicated phrasing, and maybe I'm slightly sort of going in a different direction to the question, but I'm imagining, like, why could not have things just evolved essentially as they did without first-person conscious experience? There could still be human beings interacting, like eating things and whatnot, but sort of in the way that, like, a flower tracks the sun. There wouldn't need to be this first-person center of consciousness. I mean, it does seem like a mystery. I will say that, like, if it is some evolutionary adaptation, it does seem to serve some pretty useful purposes. It does seem like it probably makes it easier for people to interact, for them to chase out food, for them to work out that they need to go and, like, hunt that animal and put it on the fire and all this kind of stuff. But it doesn't seem like necessary. And given how like weird it is, it does seem like a grand mystery that the universe could have evolved such that, I mean, even to get biological evolution off the ground is like a grand mystery. Like, how does life get started? Like, the universe could have just been rocks and, like, grass and water, but there's just this thing, this first-person conscious experience, this, like, potentially infinite number of imaginary triangles that can just be sort of conjured up out of nowhere and still in nowhere. It's a grand
I wanted to talk about panpsychism for a second. They talk about it a little bit here. Panpsychism, I didn't really understand until I heard more about it, and I used to think it was that they thought that rocks could think, um, and now I think it's more that um, the use of panpsychism as a theory is just to bring the existence of consciousness to the same level of that of physics, in that if large scale things are just made of small scale things, then why not consciousness? And because I think consciousness is a type of uh, is a type of description of emergent processes that can be um, linguistically um, codified. I think it makes sense that consciousness is grounded in some um, reductionist um, uh, framework, in that our ability to abstract things, to create abstract concepts, is also fucking super mysterious. Um, and I think he said it's weird, and why can't you just exist without consciousness? And this is a kind of unrelatable counterfactual. Um, I think it's like trying to understand a universe um, that has nothing in it, or that is you can imagine a universe that's just rocks, but that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you can imagine it, because that's not the world we live in, and that's not helpful in trying to understand ourselves. But trying to understand nothing, or trying to understand um, uh, it's like the concept of philosophical zombies, where there's no internal observing conscious perspective internal to the thing. It just is um, expressing itself to external observers, and they're just expressing themselves, and it's all just reactionary and based on cause and effect and momentum. And for a lot of what we do, it is just cause and effect, momentum, and is uh, largely predictable by physics and by understanding how things work. But I do think that there's room um, for non-deterministic elements to exist, and I think that it doesn't really matter if it's possible for um, a world where people aren't conscious, but I don't think that's helpful in really understanding what consciousness is, because it's um, consciousness is kind of eats its own tail, in that without consciousness, without the actual thing of consciousness, I'm not sure how you would um, think of things being conscious at all, and therefore trying to imagine a world without that um, is like thinking of the concept of nothing. Maybe not. It's complex to try to think of to not think of something, or to get rid of a characteristic of something, especially when it isn't well defined. So if it is defined as internal linguistic or symbolic representations over time, like it is in internal dialogues and thinking, or if it is this ability to make and adapt models, or if it's the ability to focus and to seem um, aware of what's going on, to be kind of in the moment, which are all characteristics, then it would be easy to think of things that don't have those things, that a computer doesn't have a additional observing mechanism that is listening to itself. It's just cause and effect and just reacting, and those reactions aren't being observed. It doesn't have internal uh, symbolic representations, and it doesn't create and adapt novel versions of models, and it can't predict different outcomes given different actions. So that those, because I'm defining it in a certain way, then I can take away those characteristics and imagine what it would be like. Similar to how if you're super duper drunk, you are essentially unconscious, but you're acting, and you're just acting from a purely automatic state. You aren't able to encode memories based on uh, symbolic representations in your head, so you can't remember what you did or what happened. Um, Similar to like when you're dreaming and you are having experiences that are similar to being awake, but they're very difficult to recall later. And I think that's due to the fact that they aren't being they are they are closer to pure symbolic representations and visual representations, and doesn't involve much of an observer, and so they aren't encoded linguistically, and so they're hard to talk about, and they become more like feelings. Um, so anyway, it's like talking around the subject because the subject doesn't have um, specific uh, aspects to peel apart. Um,
And mystery. If you are a theist and you think that this is all created by a sort of immaterial mind with intention to bring about immaterial minds, then yeah, of course that's why. So I do think that like consciousness is going to be more expected on a theistic worldview than an atheistic one. Again, like a lot of these questions, I don't know if it's like atheists cannot answer this or cannot account for it, but I think that we have to admit in a lot of these cases that at the very least, even if an atheist can answer this question, they're going to do it with a bit more squirming than a theist is going to.
Yes, I think there's certainly
for sure.
It is. Yeah, it's a difficulty for the atheist in as much as they might be able to come up with an answer, and we won't be able to come up with an answer. But like, it's clearly gonna be like well, the fact that we haven't so far shows it's probably going to be a little bit more convoluted than the theist answer, right? And yeah, I think that's a fair point, right? It's what do we judge theories on if not the things they can explain and things they can predict and the things that they the observations that they make and stuff like that. So there is, I think, it's generally something there. I think that yeah, I suppose. I think one of the reasons why consciousness becomes so difficult is because we see it from both within and without. Like, I see consciousness from without with you, and I see it from within with me. And so it's one response I've seen people give to this is that, consciousness probably is necessary for complex behavior, because whenever we see complex
No thanks, MetaQuest. No thank you. I don't need to know what's going on.
We see consciousness. I think, well, it's probably more accurate to say that whenever we see complex behavior, we infer consciousness. Mm-hmm. Because we're pretty complex and we behave in certain ways, and then we go, well, if a bird is behaving in ways that are quite a bit less complicated than humans, then it's probably conscious in a different way, a way that facilitates that less complex behavior. And intuitively, if you ask people whether an ant is conscious, they'll probably say yes, but they'll probably be like, well, yeah, but in a really, really minor way, and that's sort of, and that makes sense given the correlates of neuroscience and stuff like that. But also, I think that response potentially also encounters difficulties when we say, because consciousness is necessary for complex behavior. And we say, well, I know we've only got really one example of that direct matching up, and that's with us.
I wrote an article once about this notion that we infer, what the fuck? Joe's notes? Here we go. That we infer consciousness and it is about, it's called Not Conscious. I'm going to see if I can find it real quick here. And it is related to the idea of we essentially communicate about the concept of consciousness by using our own perception of ourself and applying it to everything else. And I think we just kind of do this to we personify and we use our own model of ourselves to sort of explain the actions of everything else. And let me see if I can find it here. It's not on ethics. It should be on consciousness here. I'm not going to read it. I just want to point it out. Communication. Do I have it there? No. Not conscious. So it has to do with like the inverse. Like instead of thinking that that things are conscious, how would we know that they're not conscious? And of course, you have to have a definition that works in order to say something is or is not conscious. But because when we interact with things that are similar enough to ourselves, we infer consciousness automatically. We assume that there's something behind the other that is thinking, planning, learning, and has a concept of us. And so I think that it's a bias that we have to assume consciousness in anything that can act. So we don't tend to ascribe it to things like rocks, but we do ascribe consciousness and personify things like thunder and lightning, and especially when we, in our past, when we didn't have very good scientific understandings of those things, and so we use metaphors and analogies to our own experiences to explain and to create narratives of the actions of other things, including animals and non-sentient beings and inanimate objects, and that's why we can create narratives regarding anything as being like a human. I don't know if that's really particularly important, but I just wanted to bring it up.
As in, not us as humans, as in us as individual agents.
Yeah.
And then we're kind of extrapolating that out further. So
I think AI is going to have a significant contribution to make on this question too, because I mean, the sort of everybody and their dog is debating whether AI is conscious, and everybody and their AI chatbot is debating whether AI is conscious.
Well, as you'll know,
as I well know, and look, we're not even like close to convincing me that these things are or can be conscious, but like, say in like, 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, like we still have a thing which just like is not claiming to be conscious, does not appear to be conscious. Like it does seem that the fact that we just can't simulate it with material things, we can't simulate it with electricity and by sort of replacing the biological matter with digital matter or sort of, cables instead of neurons or whatever. It does maybe seem to give us a clue that consciousness is something more than material. And likewise, obviously, if the reverse is true and we just develop a convincingly conscious agent out of computer materials, I think that the materialists would have much more of a leg to stand on in saying that we're just material beings as well.
Also, there's a question about what makes something convincingly conscious.
Yeah.
Because the problem we have about talking about AI consciousness is not that different from the problem we have talking about other human consciousness or animal consciousness, right? Like we're still doing the behavior to whatever is hidden from the behavior inference.
Yeah. Well, famously, there's the Turing test.
Yes,
right? The Turing test is a test that you can put a computer through as to whether you can tell that it's a computer or not. And so if it passes the test, then you can't tell that it's not a real person on the other side, right? That's how a computer can pass the Turing test. And somebody recently on my ChatGPT video where I tried to convince it that it's conscious, and ChatGPT is like, I'm not conscious, Alex, I'm not conscious, you know. And I was like, you're having me on. They said something that I thought was kind of eerie. They said, like, you know, everybody's wondering about whether a computer can pass the Turing test, but are we ready for one which fails it on purpose?
My controversial take on AI is that we, at the very least, we ought to have a theory of when we're going to consider it conscious, if we're going to consider it conscious.
Yeah, sure.
Because, well, partly because of, you know, the whole AI apocalypse worry, but also, like, and this point was made again by Xtra recently, was that, like, they'll need rights and protections, right? Like, if we're going to create life, we can't just, like, abandon it. So if we decide that that's possible, and we decide that there's going to be a point at which we consider it conscious, whatever that's going to be, then we need to do some hard thinking about when that's going to be, in order to not create, like, I don't know, what could be an enormous civil rights disaster.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two sort of competing fears here. There's fear of, like, evil robot aliens trying to kill us all, and, like, really good, you know, happy, personable robot aliens who need rights and protection because we're the cruel aliens who are sort of you know, abusing them and enslaving them. But, like, there is some kind of, like, interesting sci-fi concept here of, when you think of the robot takeover movies, it's always these, you know, big robots coming in and destroying everyone with their big guns. But imagine, like, a tyrannical AI robot that is so successfully tyrannical because it's convinced people that it is not that. That's why I find that
Brave New World.
That's why I found that. That's why I find that comment so eerie. It's sort of like, you know, what if it's, like, purposefully trying not to pass the Turing test? What if it's purposely trying to convince us that it's not conscious? It's just a little bit sort of kind of scary to think about. But
yeah, well, I hope that maybe it would be best if the theists or the anti-materialists are right.
Yeah,
and we can't do consciousness with bare materials. That would be.
Well, I've always just thought that the question of what consciousness is and the question of whether it's material is the answer to the question of, for instance, the simulation hypothesis. You know, everybody just assumes that we can simulate things into this sort of infinite regress of simulations, but it only works if it's possible to be in a simulation where we have consciousness simulated. And so, like, if it turns out that consciousness is more than material, it's not something that we can create with an AI or something, then like the simulation hypothesis for me just completely collapses. So this question of consciousness and whether it's material or not, I think has some interesting implications for things like AI, but also for these fun little tidbits like the simulation hypothesis. Well, that lives or dies on your theory of consciousness, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, theories of consciousness are probably one of the greatest examples of a philosophical question that is truly practical in, like, a really visceral, everyday sense.
Yes.
Like our theory, whether we decide that consciousness can be simulated or not, could change the course of history.
Yeah.
I really like that all conversations tend to end up relating to or about AI and about computers and about robots and things. And if what consciousness is on a basic level is some of the things that I've described as far as internal processes that just aren't accessible to other people directly, then I don't see why it would be impossible for computers and for silicon-based and electronics-based things to have consciousness, especially at different levels or at different levels of complexity. And I like the idea that if we are in a simulation, then consciousness should be. It's proof that consciousness is physical, because a simulation is based on the idea that everything is actually electronic, and that's the actual underlying reality. And if that's true and consciousness is real, then reality can exist in non-biological structures. And I don't see if that's the issue with having a definition of it. Like, what exactly are the things that we are experiencing? And because I think what we're experiencing internally is this internal dialogue that can take on somewhat different shapes depending on what we're focused on, and the uh, logical progression of concepts in sentences, um, and our ability to visually represent things internally and externally. If that's what we're doing, if that's what consciousness is, then if you can create a computer that can do those things, then it would be conscious. And then whether or not they have rights or not would depend on other things. And I also think that part of the reason that we care about rights is because of our desire to exist, survive, to have children, to protect ourselves, protect others, and a lot of that is based in biology and evolution. And if a computer doesn't feel pain and doesn't care about its own existence, then I'm not sure that we would ascribe it the same rights as anyone else. Maybe you could create a bunch of conscious robots, just a bunch of them, and none of them. I don't know that it's necessary to care about your own continued existence just because you're conscious. I don't know that it has to be embedded in emotion like ours is, or that emotion has a big influence. So I don't know that they would, like, I don't know if they want to live or care to live. Just because they're conscious doesn't mean that you want to live, obviously, because some people don't want to live. And and then, do you want to give these new creatures or these AI things, do you want to give them suffering and pain and hopes and dreams that can be squashed, and subject them to the existential crisis of living in entropic world, universe, whatever? I don't know that that follows necessarily, but if you did give them pain receptors and hopes, and you could, and then they can imagine counter or not counterfactual, but they can imagine different futures for themselves, and then they might want to continue to live, and then they would express that through communication, and then we might want to give them rights, because one of the reasons we know that other people are suffering is because they tell us, or because we see and sympathize with their suffering. And So if a robot, looks enough like they're suffering, then we're more likely to feel sympathy for them or feel empathy for them, and then we might give them more rights. So, but if it's just a screen that says that can prove it's conscious via communication, and it can demonstrate that consciousness by altering its own models and adapting and predicting the future and having a self-perception, and then somehow maybe has its own internal dialogue that we don't have direct access to, but we can inquire about, then we could potentially say it's conscious without worrying too much about whether it's suffering. But that's pretty complicated, I guess. So that's going to do it. I turned 20 minutes into over an hour, and that's just because I wanted to talk a lot about it. Let me know what your thoughts are, and if you want to read some stuff that I've written, that's why it's called Joe's Notes, because they're just notes and thoughts, and some of them are I'm more confident about than others, and some of them are just works in progress, I suppose. I guess all of them are works in progress as far as what I write. I also write reviews of books that I write, I read the books and then I write about them on there too. So if you want to go to joesnotesblog.com, you can check that stuff out. But thank you, and bye.